Hey guys, welcome back. In this 7th lesson of the official Bolt series, we're going to set up the key and door functionality. So at the moment, on level 2, we have a door in the way of our flag. So if I try to get to the flag, the door blocks me. I want to have to grab the key first, and then go to the door, and it will unlock and I can go to the flag. That's what I want to happen, so let's do that. Now if I look at the door, the reason it's blocking me is because it has a collider on it that I cannot walk through. So what we want to do is once we have the key, if we have the key and we touch the door, I want to disable the collider on the door. Now for this to work on my player, I want to have a variable that we can keep track of whether or not we have the key. So I'll create an object variable and I will call it hasKey. Now whenever we grab the key, I'll set this to true. Whenever we don't have the key, it will default to false. So this will be a boolean, so a bool. There we go. Now I also want to be able to reference the player object from other objects, such as the door. I want the door to know, does the player have the key? So when I touch the door, it can then easily find the player. There's a few ways we can do that, but the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to create an application variable that will be available throughout the entire application. So in application variables, I'm going to add one that is player. Now this will be set from the player, but it can be accessed from anywhere. And it's going to be a game object type. It's going to reference the player's game object itself. And the way this is going to work is in my player controller graph, I'm going to assign the player's object to that variable. And since the player controller's graph is on the player, it's very easy to do. We're going to do this when the level starts. So I'm going to add a start event here. And then what I want to do is assign the app variable. So I'm going to right click and I want to say set player, and that allows me to set the player application variable. Then I want to drag this flow directly into that so it gets activated at the start. And the value I want to assign to it, if I drag out this object port here, is going to be self, which means it's going to reference itself. So a game object reference of itself. Add another group here, player app variable will be fine. Now let's set up the functionality for actually collecting the key. So if we run into the key, we want to actually collect the key. How do we do that? Let's go to our key object here, and I want to add a flow machine to the key, and we're going to create a new macro once again. I will call this key. Now for key, we don't need either of these events. What we need are events for colliding with the player. And luckily for us, we have this cool little super unit we created that allows us to pass in a tag and then control what happens if we run into an object with that tag. So I'm going to take the target out of that, and what do we want to do? We want to actually set the variable on the player that says hasKey to true, right? So what I can do is say set object variable, and I want to set it to be true. And which variable do I want to set? I want to set hasKey. But here's the question. hasKey is a variable on the player object, not on the key object. So I cannot set it to hasKey on self, which is the key. I have to set it to the object that we collided with, in this case, the player. So take the object out port that we run out there and drag it into the set variable object. Now it'll set the hasKey variable on the player's object. And I want to assign the value. Now this was a boolean, so a true or false. And if I run into this, that means it should be set to true because I am in fact collecting the key. But once we run into it, we don't want the key to still be in the map, right? We want it to disappear because we already collected it. It should be gone. There's only one key and one door in this case. So once you touch the key, let's destroy the key. And I can do that by passing the flow from after we set the variable into a unit called destroy. And I want to do game object destroy, and it takes an obj or an object type. And the game object that we want to destroy is in fact self, right? So the key, because this graph is on the key, so self will reference the key's game object in this case. So let's try that out. So the door is closed, get the key disappeared, and let's check our player here to see if we have the key. Player object hasKey is true. Now all I have to do is when I collide with a door, I want it to check the player's hasKey variable to see if it does in fact have the key. If it does, the door unlocks and we can go through. So let's do that. Let's make sure on the key object that we apply our changes so that it will actually affect all of our prefabs throughout our scenes. And now on our door object, I want to add another flow machine. Let's create another macro. Let's call it door. And again, in door, we don't need start or update. All we care about in door is, did we collide with the player? Again, just drag out on collision with, pass in the player tag, and we're good to go. So if we did collide with the door, we have to check, do we have the key? How do we do that? Well, we can reference the variable the same way we did on set variable by passing in the player's object and grabbing the has key value. So let's grab that value from the player's has key variable. So get object variable, and the variable I want is has key, and we have to grab this from the player that we collided with, just like that. So based on that variable, whenever we collide with the door should decide, do I open or do I not open? And to make that decision, we'll add another branch in here. So do a branch, and let's pass in our variable value to that branch and pass the flow from the collision check directly into that branch. Now, if the variable result was true, and in fact does have a key, then what we want to do is disable the collider, right? Because the collider is the only thing stopping us from walking through. So I'll type in box collider, and it is the 2D version of box collider. And what we want to do on this is we want to set enable to be false. So go down to set enabled, and it's going to in fact be false. So just do not check the box. And that's going to disable the collider on the door object so we can walk directly through it. So let's test this out. Make sure we apply our changes and play. Now let's go get our key, and let's touch the door. Cool, I went right through it. But the door still looks closed and locked to me. So what I want to do is, once we have the key and we touch the door, I want to display a different door sprite that looks open so we can walk through it and know for a fact that it is open. But as it is, that works pretty good. So let's do that. After we disable the collider, what I want to do is, on the sprite renderer for the door, I want to change the sprite to be the opened version. So I'm going to drag this out here, and I want to type in set sprite. Now you have a few options here, but we care about the sprite renderer because this is a sprite in our game that has a sprite renderer component on it, and we're going to be setting the sprite field to a new sprite. Now the sprite, I can simply click on this little dot right here to open up a browser to find the sprite I'm looking for. So I'll click on that, and what I want is the door open. So currently we have the door closed. I want the door to be open once we unlock the door. And what I want to do just for testing here is I'm going to say, if we do not have the key but we collide with the door, so false on the key value. If we do not have that, let's actually log out just a message here to the console using a string here that says need the key. Very simple. So now let's grab the key. I have the key. Now let's go to the door. Boop. And the door opens. And I can go to the objective here. But what happens is I load the same scene again. Now the reason that happens is because we did not change the variable that says what scene is to be loaded in this scene, or other scenes in fact. So let's do that quickly. This is defined on our objective object. And from level 2 we would load level 3, and so on. Now the last thing we need to do is actually update the UI if we collect the key. So we have an empty key icon here that says I do not have a key, but there is a key available in the scene somewhere. So whenever I collect the key, oops, I want to update the UI element here that says, okay, I now have a key, you can unlock the door. So to do that, all we have to do is change the sprite to the full key sprite once we collect the key. And to do this, we're going to do this directly on the key object itself in our heads up display scene. So I'm going to open up my heads up display scene, and under row, we have the hearts, the key, and the projectile weapon icon. So on the key, we're going to create another flow machine. Now for this one, the flow graph is a one-time thing. It's only going to be used on the single UI element and for nothing else. So what I can do is I can use an embed source, which will actually directly embed the graph in the flow machine. It won't be a reusable macro like we have here. It'll simply be embedded in the machine itself, which is all we need for this. So for this, I don't need the start event, but I want to use the update event. And what we want to do is we're going to check to see, does the player have the key? If he does, the sprite is this sprite. If he does not, the sprite is a different sprite. Pretty simple to do. So every single frame, we're going to check to see, does the player's has key variable say that the player has the key, or do they not have the key? If they do have the key, I want to show a sprite that has the key filled in. If they do not have the key, I want to show the empty sprite. And we're going to do that by selecting it based on the value of the player's has key variable. So I'll drag out the flow from the update event, and I will set the sprite. Now I want to set the sprite this time on the image component. This isn't a sprite in game, it's a UI image, so it's under the image component called set sprite. And now for this, I don't know directly what sprite it's going to be, right? I can't just select it in this little browser here. What I have to do is select it dynamically. So I'm going to drag this out so we can actually assign a sprite based on some values. And I want to do a select because we're going to be selecting a sprite based on the bool of has key. So if it is true, we'll select this sprite. If it is false, we'll select that sprite. So I'll do a select. And the bool that we're going to be evaluating is from the player's has key variable. So how do we do that? Well, we have that variable set up in the player that is an application variable called player that has a reference directly to the player's game object, right? So all I have to do is, first of all, get that value from the variable for player. So I'll add a unit and I'll type in get player. And that allows me to get the player's application variable called player. And this has a direct reference to the player's object, which is exactly what I need because the has key value is on player. Then what I want to do is add another unit here. There'll be get object variable. And the object variable that I want to get is from the player. So I'll drag this in to the game object reference and say the has key variable that is on player is the value I want. So there we go. I now have a reference to the has key variable. And I'm going to drag this out to evaluate in our select. So if that is true, we'll do one thing. If it is false, we'll do another. So we have the key or we don't have the key. So if we in fact have the key, we want to assign a different sprite than if we did not have a key, right? So I'm going to type in sprite and I want to go to sprite literal. It allows us to define a sprite reference just like this. And I select this dot once more and I can decide what sprite to show if we have the key. So if we have the key, let's come down here and it's called HUD key full. So it's the full filled in key sprite. So I'll select that and add that if we do in fact have the key. If we don't have the key, again, sprite literal, and I'll set this to be the empty key. So HUD key empty. And that's all it takes. So every frame we're going to be evaluating this. Again, there might be a better way to handle this. Say you only update it when you collide with the key or something of that nature. But in my case, this game is definitely not going to be hurting on performance. So it's not that big of a deal to do this check every single frame. So let's save this scene. Control S. And go back into my second level. So now if I test this out and I have my player selected and I go over to object, what I can do is I can change the value myself manually to true, the key shows up, and to false, it goes away. So I know it's working. Now let's just try it out in game. Grab the key, it lights up, pretty cool. Now I can walk through the door and go to the next level. And here we are at the next level, and there's actually an enemy on this level. We'll talk about that later. My name is Austin, and I will see you in the next lesson.